So our 5-minute grace period has expired. Let's go ahead and launch into this fruit tree pruning talk. I tend to get a little excited and run all over the map. So if you feel that we're straying, just feel free to reach out and say, hey, can you touch on that point again? Or hey, where did you leave off there? I'll introduce the two of us in a moment. We're very good about trying to stay on point. This is about fruit tree pruning. We're going to focus primarily on deciduous fruit trees. So please refrain from things that stray too far outside of that. Even though the pruning responses are going to be almost, well, not almost, they are identical in citrus, guava, your evergreen fruit varieties, avocado. We're not going to go deep into that. You can imagine there's millennia of information we're trying to cram into an hour and a half. So that's the objective for today. My name is Fred. I'm the owner of Vintage Tree Care here in Santa Rosa. This is Kamala Dionne, my trusty colleague, and this is a great back and forth Laurel and Hardy-ish show. It's very fun, interactive. We're going to give you a lot of good information. Thanks, Miley and Phil Pieri, for letting us do this. This is something near and dear to our hearts. We really appreciate trees and feel honored to, share with you what we've learned over all these years and, hopefully leave you a little more enlightened. So everybody got a flyer, yes. Harmony, we've partnered with Harmony Farm Supply for several years now doing fruit tree talks, and they've been kind enough to extend a 10% discount on, I don't know if it's one purchase or one-time purchase. Anybody who wasn't able to receive a coupon, we ran out. They said, hey, just go to Harmony. It's good till the end of the month, I believe. And you say, hey, I was at the Scion Exchange and I didn't get a coupon, but I'd love to see if I can still recover it. They said, no problem. So check in with them. So thanks to Harmony. Kamala, should I have added something or does that just try it?
I think you're ready to proceed, yeah.
Okay, let's try it out. So we're gonna jump right into it and I'm hopeful this little thing works. It was working great when no one was here. So we're going to talk about deciduous fruit tree pruning. Okay, so a little bit of acknowledgement of what time I've put into the industry, and Kamala will talk about hers. This isn't to brag or to boast or to blow a horn, yet as much to, I'm already getting dry, yet as much to demonstrate that the information you're getting comes from a qualified source. So I've been in the tree care industry for over 30 years now. 19 years as a business owner, past president of professional organizations within the tree care industry, frequent presenter at workshops such as this one and other field training workshops. Excuse me. And experience in municipal, utility, and residential tree care. The relevance there is that we've seen a lot of trees. I've been watching. I was taught by someone with decades of experience. I then carried on to today. We've seen a lot of pruning responses, a lot. There are very few pruning responses that surprise us, and that's because we've been doing it for a long time. Kamala, can I introduce you and then let you dig in further? So Kamala Dionne, certified arborist as well, has been working here for 6 years now, and it's a great relationship. Kamala's a dear soul and very passionate about trees. If you ever work with her, you will see why. So Kamala's a little bit about Kamala. She's got a BA in Environmental Conservation and Restoration. And the list goes on, and I will go tongue-tied to talk about all the things that Kamala is good at. Most importantly, she's excellent with people, understands trees, and carries a passion to carry on the culture here at Vintage Tree Care. Okay, so topics we're going to cover today. And I'm trying to go a little quick because an hour and a half may sound like a lot of time, but literally at the end of this, there will be more questions than time to answer them. And we do need to be respectful of the workshop that comes after ours. I believe it's a crafting demonstration, so we'll have to ship out quickly. We're going to try and condense this to an hour-ish to allow for some questions and answers. So today we're going to touch on basic tree biology and anatomy, identification of fruitful wood versus vegetative growth, pruning responses, structural development and training systems, young tree versus mature tree care. And this may sound a little overwhelming to some of you, but don't worry, by the time we leave, you'll have some information to put behind each one of these headings. And hopefully you'll feel a bit more empowered to go into your orchards or someone else's orchard and take it on. Okay, basic tree biology. Here's where we go into our flyer. So on the first page, I gotta do the same thing. Grab one of these guys. Steal one of those from me? Thank you. So, okay, on the first page, the one that has the twig anatomy. For some of you, this is going to be a review. Bear with me. I know it's going to sound boring because you've heard it, but for those of you who have not, this is going to be awesome. These are the building blocks that are going to take you into how to manage your trees because you need to know what part of the plant you're working with before you work with it. So basic tree biology. Before we get to that flyer, I'm going to explain it. So in the plant, we've got, this is very simple, right? Simplified. We've got roots, right? The roots interface with the ground. They anchor the tree. They bring up minerals, nutrients, moisture. They store energy, and they create the relationship between the soil and the above ground environment. Very crucial. No root zone, no top zone. The top, we have wood development to support framework for leaf positioning. Right? And you may think, okay, that's still pretty simple, I get it, right? Well, the leaves are up there because they're doing the work for the plant. They're doing some of the more important work. Without leaves, we don't need anything else because it won't sustain itself. The leaves produce the energy. Now the energy then is shared with the wood and used with the wood and stored in the roots, and the roots bring up the nutrients to photosynthesize, and there's your brief science lesson. Now, there's one other step in plant development that we all know about, and that's the reproductive process. The reproductive process is what we are really trying to manipulate to our advantage, right? We're trying to get the most fruit, the most beautiful fruit, the tastiest fruit for the longest period of time that we can. So this is the point that we're going to really teach about today, how the pruning can affect those other components of the tree to bring about the most robust reproductive process. Okay, so now we are in to our twig anatomy. This is the part where, again, it sounds kind of slow and dry, but it's so crucial to go into the next steps of determining how, where, and when to prune. So the very top of this diagram, very, very top, the first thing that's mentioned on there, Mac, you following along? All right, I like it. Terminal bud. Does anybody know what a bud is, like by definition? Anybody just throw something out? No? Okay.
New growth.
New growth. Okay, new growth. That's a great way to put it. The definition that we like to use is it's an unexpanded growth point. Right? It's a potential growth position on the plant. So when we refer to a bud, that's what we're talking about, an unexpanded growth point. Now when we give it a name in front of the word bud, we're giving it a location. So we've got a terminal bud, which means it's at the end of the twig, the top, the shoot, the lateral branch. It's at the very end. Kamala is pointing it out here. If you drop down just a little bit below there, we're still staying into the anatomical positioning. We've got axillary buds on the right-hand side of this diagram. You can see where it says axillary buds. Axillary buds are unexpanded growth points that exist in the leaf axial. So the leaf axial is where the petiole attaches to the twig. I don't know, maybe I'll get some nods out of this, but when you're pruning a rose, for example, you see a little leaf coming off the side of the twig. Well, I know I can prune to that leaf because there's an axillary bud in there, and that's a growth point. So axillary buds are important to know. Interchangeably, so axillary bud is commonly interchanged with two other terms that I hear. A dormant bud when the leaves are gone, or a lateral bud, or a node. So you can call it a lateral bud or a node. And it's interchangeable, but then there are specifics in why we would call it a node. So a node, again, is a bud on the side of the branch or the twig that has an unexpanded growth point. Now the distance between two nodes is what we call the internode. Now nodes are going to exist in different dimensions on different plants. If you have a really fast growing species, a lot of times you will have a lot of internodal length. That allows for the shoot elongation. It's not relevant necessarily how fast the tree grows in all circumstances, yet it's important to know nodal, internodal, and we'll touch on that as we get in further. So now here's where it gets to be more exciting. So let's look at the left side of this diagram, and there's in a bracket, the very top, it says this year's growth, 1 year old. So if I was by a show of hands to say, hey, run out there onto that peach tree and tell me last year's growth, like 1 year old, can you all go out and find it without question? Everybody, getting some nods? Okay, so the reason it's important to know is because the age of the wood will tell you, depending on the species, where this fruiting is going to occur, right? So now, the next bracket down shows last year's growth, 2 years old. And then the third bracket down shows the growth of 2 years ago, so 3-year-old growth. Once you get past about 3 years, it's hard to determine the age of the wood because the morphology of the bark is different. Now, does anybody know what distinguishes the distances between last year and this year? What anatomical feature do we look for? And this is just a quiz, no one needs to know, but I'm seeing if nobody throw it out there.
Differentiation of bark?
Scar. Yeah, sort of differentiation of bark, but scar. Bud scale scar. So if you go down And thank you, that was good. So right at the very, it's a different appearance in the bark. If you were to go from the terminal bud, right, terminal bud always, and I'll tell you why in a second, and you travel back toward the point of attachment, the point of origin, the parent stem, you're going to come across, on a deciduous tree especially, you're going to see this little lumping of shrugging growth right there. It's not really shrugging growth, but shrugging features on the bark. That is where last year's terminal bud, or dormant bud on the lateral edge, opened up and expanded its growth. So this is my favorite analogy, right? The artichoke one. Who here has eaten an artichoke? Yeah, all right, okay, good. You've had an artichoke? So when you peel off those bud scales, that's a flower bud you're eating, right? So when you peel off those bud scales, you know when you're done and you have that thing in your hand and it has all those little knobby features around it, that you just made a bud scale scar out of your artichoke. So that's what happens on the tree. When that terminal bud expands in spring, it casts those scales. And when those scales come off, it leaves a scar around the twig. So if you go from the terminal bud backwards, you find your bud scale scar. You go from that bud scale scar traveling downward toward the parent stem, toward the point of origin, you will find another bud scale scar. If you travel down toward the point of origin again, you will find typically a third one. After that, again, it dissolves into the bark texture. So to find 4-year-old growth, you'd have to cut into the stem and count the rings and all this stuff. So it's typically irrelevant. Okay, does anybody know what, Kamala, I know you know. Does anybody know why it's important to do the terminal bud backwards measurement versus just, hey, look, I see one, it's 3 feet long. Therefore, I will infer that all 3 feet on this tree is last year's growth. Is that a safe assumption? I got a no on that one. If you, Kamala, grab that. There you go. Perfect. Okay. Here's a great example. Let me see if I can find. So Kamala's holding up here Santa Rosa plum limb, right? So I can't touch that, right? Maybe I have to throw my ladder up, or I can try and see, okay, well, there's a terminal bud way at the top, I know. I can't tell if there's a bud scale scar. So wait, let me, oh, here's a little side shoot, right? Okay, here's a terminal bud on it. So I'm gonna go backwards, and I go, oh, there's a bud scale scar. Okay, that's, what, 2 feet, right? Oh, well then, that must mean that my bud scale scar is up there at 2 feet. Is that safe to assume? No, oh, I love this class. Okay. If I were to go from that terminal bud and come down, 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 right here, so I've got like 6 feet of 1-year-old growth on this tree. So, well, if I go, wait a second, maybe I was wrong. Maybe it's all 6 feet. So it's not, right? Every part of the plant, depending on sunlight exposure, depending on the species, is going to have different growth increments. So if I wanted to utilize this wood, and as we get deeper into this talk, we'll talk about how to transition this into fruitful and how it can be purposeful for our intentions. I have to be able to see the differences to know where to make the pruning cuts. And then we'll give you something to think about in why you would make the cuts. So down in here, and this is jumping ahead, and then we're going to go back to something else. If you might not be able to see it from there, but these are very smooth. The buds are very clean and streamlined. And then you get down into here, and it gets all craggy and kind of knobby. That's where we transition into fruitful wood, right? But I'm going ahead. I'm going to come back because we're going to talk about it right now. So go into the next part of the flyer. So jump out of the anatomy part. And this one here, this is all information that was plagiarized from a book written in the 50s about orchard production. It came out of UC Davis. Most of the information we're giving you here, this is just for demonstrative purposes. You can use it. It's still relevant to a degree, but it is solely through the lens of fruit tree production. I mean, we're talking where economics clash with nothing with aesthetics. It's just flat out, how can we mass produce fruit? And they might pull these trees out every 10 years, maybe less, right? So a lot of you we're talking to are people that may want to nurture an orchard tree for decades. You may nurture a tree that's limping along, but it means a lot to you. So we're going to teach you how to care for all trees, but just know that the information here isn't the gospel truth. It's through the lens of economics and fruit tree production. Okay, so you go inside of this flyer, and at the very top it says almond or almond, depending on where you're from, right? And I have a differentiation, a mental memory of why to separate the two sayings, but that's for later. So go to the next one. It says apple. Does everybody see the heading apple? Yeah. Okay, so under here I put 4 or 5 bulleted points about things that are unique to apple. Okay, so let's go down to the third bulleted point. It says produce most of their fruit terminally, right? So we know that's on the end of something, on spurs that are found on wood 2 years and older. Okay, so just sit with that for a second and say, so if anywhere that's going to be fruitful on my apple tree has to be 2 years old or older. You can't make it genetically different. It's just, you can't break that rule, but 2 years or older. So now if I go into my apple tree, I immediately know that if I'm in there digging out 2 and 3 year old wood, for whatever reason, I'm throwing away fruitful wood. That's not wrong, but you need to know that that's what you're doing. Does everybody follow me so far? So now we see the reason to know how to tell the age of the wood, and now we know a species characteristic of one type of fruit tree. But I've got a question for the guy in the front. Would you prune an apple tree the way you would prune a peach tree? No. Let's flip to peach nectarine in this little flyer. Good guess? Yeah. This is my dad, by the way, and he taught me about fruit trees when I was knee high. So let's go to peaches and nectarines. And Kamala, I'll let you jump in a second so I can save some.
Here's a real life example of a peach or nectarine.
Thank you, Kamala. Well, oh, there we go. Okay. Everybody there? Hear rustling coming to a cease? That means we're finding it. Okay, peach and nectarine. Let's throw a couple things out on this one. Number one, the fruiting habits of peaches and nectarines are, for all intents and purposes, identical. So you don't need to, when I go into an orchard to prune a tree, I go, oh, that peach tree over there, well, that happens to be a nectarine. It is great to know, so I know if I wanted to sell the fruit, but when I prune it, I just need to know it's a peach/nectarine. That's it. I'm going to prune it the same way. So look at the bulleted item number 2. Bears fruit almost entirely on 1 year old shoots, last year's growth. Okay, so now if I were to, not on 2 years, not on 3 years. So if I were to go through and prune out all of last year's growth, and when we get a little bit further into this talk, you'll hear why, oh, I was doing that, and I wonder why I didn't get much fruit. We go to a lot of people's homes, they have a beautiful peach tree, beautiful. And they go, I don't know. I didn't get any peaches last year, the year before. And I'm looking, I can tell, right? Like I can see the historic pruning. And I say, well, tell me a little bit more. Like, oh, I got a dud. You don't get duds. The genetics are in there. You can't prune out, you can't plant out, you can't water out, you can't change the genetics. And I say, I'll tell you what, give me 1 year. If you don't get more fruit this coming year, then let's take it out, right? Maybe you do have a dud, right? Wink. And then sure enough, they go, oh man, I got more fruit last year. It's really about the habits. So what was happening is somebody was applying the habits to a peach tree that they were to the apple or pear tree, which you wouldn't apply to a persimmon tree, which you wouldn't apply to a quince tree. And we're gonna teach you more about why that's important to know. Now you won't kill your tree if you prune it out. So don't sweat that you're gonna bring about harm, but you are gonna alter its fruit and behavior. Let's see where we're at on this thing. Sometimes these slides back up what I'm saying, but I get ahead of myself. Okay, anatomical features of the plant. Here's where we talk about 1 year old growth, right? So does anybody know what a water sprout is? You don't need to yell it out, just show of hands. Okay, a few hands. Now check this out. How many of you have heard of the word sucker?
Oh yeah.
Okay, right? Are they the same?
No.
No, I got a couple no's. I'm gonna tell you why they are not the same. All right, especially in the fruit tree world. Not so much, you could go out to an oak tree and you could have a shoot coming up off the ground, and you could call it a sucker because it's below the ground level, but it's the same genetic information as the parent plant. When we talk about fruit trees, I don't want to go in deep because you're the graft person, right? For simply put, fruit trees are grafted onto rootstocks that are not the same variety as what you have on the top. So a water sprout is a vigorous shoot arising from above the graft union. We're talking fruit trees, right? Above the graft union of the tree, typically originating from larger diameter stems. They're usually not lateral buds that are erupting into growth. They shoot out of the middle of the tree. Have you ever gone out to your tree and just seen floods of little twigs like pencils shooting up through there? Those are water sprouts. And they have all of the genetic information of that parent plant. I can take a young water sprout in an apple tree, even though it's all leaves this year, and I can wait till next year, and what do I know? At 2 years old and older, it becomes fruitful. So I can transition a water sprout into a fruitful structure should I elect to. Whereas on a peach tree, if I went in and cut out all my water sprouts, that's my fruitful wood for this coming year, right? So the difference between a water sprout, this is what it looks like at the base of the tree. This is a fig tree. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a little shoot erupting off of the bark, kind of a large diameter stem. It's not a lateral bud, it's a bud that comes out from beneath the bark. This is a pomegranate, but mine's not grafted onto anything, so even though those are coming out of the soil, I still call them water sprouts because they're the same genetic information. Now conversely, suckers, right? Here's where it's very crucial because Kamala and I were certified arborists, right? And that it sounds loud and obnoxious, but really what it means is if I say, hey, Kamala, go out in that orchard while I talk to the customer and I want you to cut all the suckers off the trees, she knows what I'm talking about, right? If I say, hey, I want you to cut the water sprouts out of the trees, she's going to another part of the plant, right? Very crucial to know. So these two terms water sprout is seldom used. Sucker is always used, and it's such a different term. So we're trying to really define the terms on this. So sucker is a vigorous shoot arising at or below the graft union. So almost always we see that the root stock has a higher vigor than the top stock. So if you turn your back on that sucker, let's say you have 80 fruit trees, right? Especially the ones with the plum root stalks, they love to shoot up. You'll go ahead and you'll walk out there one day and you kind of won't be able to tell the true foliar difference. You'll just go, whoa, that tree's really racing off. Boy, the left side of that tree is doing better than the right side. I don't know what's going on, but looks happy to me. 2-3 years later, you come out and, Fred, this thing's doing great. The peaches taste like heck though, right? Well, those aren't the peaches that you bought. That's the root stock that took over on you. So that's why it's so crucial to cut those suckers out constantly. The second you see them, cut them out of there. Okay, so this is what suckers tend to look like. They come out of the base of the tree. This is undeniably a different variety than this. I've never seen a peach tree that's planted on its own rootstock. So all this here, if left unattended, will become competitive for your upper portion of the plant, and it's not the desired species. So far, so good, Kamala?
Are there ways suppressing, suckers? Because like our Santa Rosa plum gets dozens and dozens of suckers, small little suckers.
Manual. That's about the only way to suppress them. Yeah, just keep cutting them. So great question, by the way. So there are, you go to these tree conferences and there's all kinds of chemicals that'll suppress the reproductive process, slow down growth, and minimize balls and liquid ambers, all this stuff. It's going to impede some natural process in the plant. Do not use an herbicide because that'll get pulled into the plant itself. I've never heard of anything that's so guaranteed and so foolproof that I would use anything other than mechanical means. And I wouldn't use a weed whipper or anything like that, even though it's a little quicker. Manual means, hand pruners, loppers, something like that. Question?
I've understood that cutting them may promote more of the growth from that location, but if you break them off, then you're more likely to have a permanent solution.
Interesting point, and I can touch on that a little deeper. I want to see if this question overlaps, and I'll come right back to that one.
Do suckers provide photosynthesis to the plant? Like, if you have a sucker that can get into the sun faster than the rest of the plant, is there any benefit?
Yeah, so okay, let me go to this. So the first question, if everyone didn't hear it, is, hey, I've heard that if you just nibble off the suckers, they just keep coming back, but I hear tearing them off eliminates it. True and false. True in the sense that that sucker has buds, lateral buds, just like this does. So if you were to cut that sucker and you left a couple of lateral buds beneath the cut, whoop, it shoots back. It inspires it to respond. If I tear it off, which is a little more damaging to the parent plant, I do eliminate that regrowth potential, but you'll just have another one come up somewhere else. If that rootstock has a propensity to sucker, it's gonna do it either way. The best thing you can do is try and find its true point of origin and sever it as close to the point of origin as you can. But digging, thrusting at it with an implement can be damaging to the plant. Now to your point about, hey, do the suckers photosynthesize and give energy back to the plant? Now we're going into kind of this cosmic, like, hey, look, what's best for the plant? Oh yeah, I mean, that sucker, you can let it get huge, it'll photosynthesize, it'll store energy. Whether or not it shares it with the rest of the tree, I don't think so, because there's a lot of independence to different parts of the plant. So yes, it will, but if you get rid of it quickly, it doesn't have a chance to even become a distraction for the plant. It allows the energy to go into the main part. So yes, it will, but it's not to the benefit long-term of the plant. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. The one useful thing I've done with suckers is air layer them to make them a new rootstock.
Yeah, great point. So now we're getting into the propagation part of it, but totally true. Then you get, it's like the rootstock. I already know this rootstock works, and now I can air layer it, get some roots, cut it, and start all over. Good point. I'm gonna go back to where we're at here, suckers versus water sprouts. Everybody feel pretty comfortable if I say, hey, all right, now we're all going into this 1,000-tree orchard, and I'm giving all of you a pair of hand pruners. I want you to cut the suckers only. We feel pretty comfortable where we're going? All right, good, I like it. Taught you something. So if nothing else, you can tell your friends you learned about that. All right, so example of fruit tree bearing locations on certain varieties of trees. This isn't all the trees, right? These are examples to inspire thought, to make you think, to go to the references to become better at your orchard management. Okay, Kamala, you're almost up, by the way. So pear tree, again, I plagiarized this information from this book, almost identical to apple. I prune apples and pears the same. I prune peaches and nectarines the same. So you can geek out on how long the spurs live, 15 to 20 years. Again, this is fruit tree production related. If you're gonna pull out a hand lens and see how many years a fruit spur has, and you're gonna thin them out according to how many years, you will be standing at one tree for many hours, right? It's more of a concept to keep in mind if I have a really old part of the plant or I have too many spurs versus, and I'll talk in a second about the two differences, but if I have too many spurs versus vegetative parts of the plant, I may thin them out to minimize a lopsided behavior in the plant. Here's the difference. On the left, here's my bud scale scar right here. Up here is last year's growth. It's not 2 years old yet, so it's not fruitful. It is purely vegetative. Vegetative meaning that it only has leaves. It's just going to do photosynthesis. It's going to help the plant store energy. Now, when I get down, here's my bud scale scar. So now I'm into the 2 year. It might be hard to see in this photo, but the morphology changes. These buds become swollen. They become kind of pronged in appearance. Here's an extreme example over here of what a fruit spur looks like on a pear tree. It is stacked with bud scale scars because the growth increment on a fruit spur is maybe a 1/16 of an inch, an 1/8 of an inch. It's not much because it's putting all of its work into fruit production. It's not shoot elongation, it's not vegetative. Now you'll get some leaves in there and they are photosynthesizing, but it's tilted in the sense that fruit is an energy consumer. Wood is an energy consumer. Every part of the plant that is not a leaf consumes energy. Leaves produce energy. Even though they consume a little bit in some of their processes, they produce far more than they consume. So if you go out to your old pear tree, for example, and it is hammered loaded with pears and just a little bit of vegetative growth, you've got a tree that's slowly losing ground. It's giving more than it's being able to produce. You may get away with that for a few years, and then you'll see a decline start to happen in the tree, almost inevitably, because it's just simple math. You can't take, and not give. So when we talk about the difference between vegetative growth and fruitful wood, we're trying to manage that balance to a degree, right? And if you err and you don't manage it for a long time and the tree suffers, it's unfortunate, but we can start over. They're fast growers. Okay, plums. We break them into two classes, Japanese versus European. Japanese plums would be like a Santa Rosa plum. European would be like a French prune or an Italian prune. Japanese tend to overproduce, so manual thinning via pruning is helpful. Manual thinning by robbing it of fruit once it sets is also helpful. If you have a massive orchard, you want to prune to try to get ahead of the fruit production. If you have a small orchard, just keep an eye on it and pluck off the fruit if it gets too busy with fruit. One of the problems with overbearing is weight distribution, branch breakage, things like that. All right, oops, sorry. So difference in the vegetative growth. Again, it's gonna transition at the 2 year old and older mark. So here's 1 year old growth. It's just got bud, all vegetative. And right about in here is where you see the morphology change into this craggy this stuff here. You can see right at my fingertips is where the bud scale scar is. You see this is very slender and streamlined. And then down here it gets real knobby and there's like tons of little buds there. Those are the fruit spurs on a plum. And that's how you can tell the difference. Any questions so far? Not glazing anybody over? All right, good. Peach nectarine trees. Okay, we talked about that they bear fruit on 1 year old wood primarily, right? So when I go and I'm filtering my lens as I look at every plant for morphology. Typically it's morphology in the twig. I don't stare so much at bud scale scars because with practice you'll see that that's not as relevant as just look for the morphology changes and you go, oh, there's the fruitful area in this plant. So here's what you're looking at. Here's a little 1-year-old shoot right there. That's where my fruit's gonna be, right? But that's also a water sprout. So when you get into these older pruning manuals, it's like, take out all the water sprouts, take out all the crossing growth. And it's really overwhelming if you don't do this daily to know what information is the right guidance, right? But I'm here to tell you that if you took out all the water sprouts on your peach tree, you would have a beautiful tree that maybe flowers and it'll have great leaves and it'll give awesome shade. But your friends are making peach pies and you're not because you're cutting out all of your fruit wood. Okay, so a little closer look. You get into that twig and there's a triple bud cluster. You've got 2 lateral flower buds, 1 little leaf bud in the middle. And if you were to go further up on that twig to the tip, you'd just see leaf buds. So that's how you can tell where your fruitful positions are going to be. If I were to, I can reduce that. If I had 20 positions on one long shoot that could bear fruit, it could get over, if I'm a peach producer, hundreds of peach trees, right? I don't have time to manually thin all my peaches, so I'll just go in there and I'll lop every shoot off by half and I'll eradicate the potential for some fruit development. That's a method, right? But again, we're talking purely productive. So if you don't feel the need to do that, don't prune it as heavy and manually remove the fruit. We're not going to get deep into how much fruit to thin and how frequently. That's another talk. Okay, tree pruning definition, fruit tree pruning. The removal or reduction of certain parts of a tree in order to modify and utilize its biological responses to enable more and better fruit for a longer period of time. Succinctly put, we're going to prune them so we get the best benefit for the longest period of time. Objectives for pruning. I think this is where you jump in, Kamala, or what?
Maybe.
Oh, do you want in on it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll take
I
a
got
few
a question,
minutes.
then I'm going to turn it over to Kamala.
Yeah, I haven't mentioned apricots. Where do they fall into the...
Okay, great question. So, question was, hey, I didn't mention apricots. Like apricots, either way, you can go. I've heard it both ways. How would I find out, right? Like, oh, the guy didn't talk about it, but what tools did I? And this is only to prove a point because it's in here. What tools do you think that you could use if you go, oh man, I have a tree you didn't talk about? Did I give you any tools yet to get you there? Do you feel comfortable? What do you think? Yeah, just tell me, or just tools in general. Like what would inspire you? How can we seek that out? Because this is going to prove a point of how we can go into a different variety even.
I had stone fruits. I imagine it would be in the same ballpark of like the peach trees, and then obviously this thing's pretty good and Google.
Well, if we go, so Google's good, but like as a cheat, there is apricot in here and we can talk about where the fruit bears. But what I want you guys to walk away with is, okay, there are a lot of varieties and we won't touch on all of them here today. But you go, okay, well look, if I find a resource, and we're gonna turn you to some resources at the end, and I'll give you the cheat sheet on it. So if I go back to apricot, you're gonna go to your resource and you're gonna say, well, how does it bear fruit, right? And usually you're gonna get a descriptor like the following, which will be apricots. Fruit occurs laterally on spurs that are typically only productive for 3 years. That's production related. Don't sweat the 3-year thing. A healthy tree, blah, blah, blah. So basically, if I know that it's going to be on spurs, it doesn't tell me the age of the spur. So I think I might be speaking out of turn on that. Well, anyhow, it's on 2-year-old and older growth. The youngest stuff is going to be vegetative. So if you go from the the terminal bud backwards, wherever my terminal bud is, I'll have to do the research on that one because I'm pretty sure it's 2-year-old and older because you get down into this old stuff and you'll get a lot of spurs on it. But that's hopefully what we're going to empower you with is knowing that if you come across a species that we didn't talk about today, that hopefully we're giving you the tools to look for that data that says, hey, it's going to be on this age of wood, born laterally, terminally on fruit spurs found in this age. And then you can go out to your orchard and use the technique of coming from terminal bud backwards. That's a great question. Did you look in there and not see it? Because I feel bad that it's not in there.
That's why.
Oh, shoot, okay, because I felt really bad. I was like, oh, he called me out. It got me good on this one. Yeah, I do see apricot, but it didn't say on what age of wood it is. But that's something that you would find out by looking in the literature in the back.
Just what I've seen, Fred, is that it's fruits they tend to fruit on last year's wood, and they can fruit predominantly either the distal, middle, or the proximal, or it depends on the varietal. And so you might want to watch for a year or two and see where you're getting most of your flowers.
Thank you for sharing that. And it's I feel a little embarrassed because I didn't have that info in here, and I feel embarrassed. Thanks for calling me out on it. It's a humility building exercise, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity. Thanks, Jeff, for the touch on that. So I'm going to turn it over to Kamala. We're going to talk a little bit about objectives for pruning, and then again, keep the questions coming. It keeps it interactive. I appreciate you listening, and I'm going to give it to Kamala. Let me know if you want me to do something, by the way.
Cool. Thank you, Fred. Yeah.
There's a little dealio.
I was noticing on this example, it does have the 1 year and then the 2 year, and you can see some, what look like some fruit spurs on there. But yeah, I think it's always good to keep an eye on your trees and figure out how your individual trees are behaving. Okay, so I'm gonna go through this, and I may have you jump back in a little bit, Fred. So there are types of cuts, different types of cuts for pruning, and the reason we were talking earlier about the anatomy so in depth is that there's the area between the nodes, the internode, and sometimes you're making cuts in that area versus making cuts maybe at the base of a branch or yeah, hopefully we'll get to some examples of that. So types of cuts, heading versus thinning. So the heading cuts are going to be, Fred, I think I maybe jumped in too early because you usually talk about this.
Okay, well, I'll jump back in. No,
that's okay.
Because I shortened this one, so I might have segued out. You want me to jump back in on that one? I was trying to, do me a favor and look up the apricot timing. I'm totally miffed by this thing.
Yeah, I'll look up the apricot. I'm going to give it back to
Just
Fred.
don't unhook my hotspot. Okay. Okay, here. Okay, lay it on us, yes.
It says apricots can be divided into 3 classes according to their fruit producing habits. In all cases, the majority of fruit is born on 1-year-old wood last year's growth. But fruit can either be mostly you have to look at the swelling of the buds. It can be either mostly at the tip of the branch, in which case you don't do a terminal cut, or it can be on the upper portion of the branch, in which case you can partially cut it back, or it can be in the lower portion of the branch, in which case you cut it mostly back.
Sounds like old Jeff was right on the money. Thank you, Jeff. Did you take off? Where are you at? Just left. Okay, just like comes in, lays down some heavy information until. No, that's that. But thanks for sharing that because and I feel a little bit humbled in the sense that I mean I've never pruned out the fruit on it, and I always thought it was in that second year. But this is a great opportunity for us to all learn something to take away, and thanks for sharing that with us. Question in the front.
On the water spout thing, can you cut that off and plant it or graft it onto another piece of rock?
I don't know if anybody heard the question. We're going off topic to a degree, and I don't have the right answer, but you can probably dip it in some root hormone and get it to grow. But again, if you're taking your top stock, if that tree came on a root stock, it's probably because its top stock doesn't have the genetics to interface well with your soil. So even though you could get it to grow, it's probably not going to be something you can put in the ground, if that makes sense. Okay, so sorry for all the segues there. So what Kamala was starting to talk about, let me bump this cart over just a hair. 1 second, everybody. Okay, so by show of hands, does anybody, Kamala will show what I'm talking about on the side here. Does anybody know the difference between a heading cut and a thinning cut? Don't have to speak it out, just I want to see a show of hands. Okay, that's about half of what I'm seeing, and I'm hopeful that by the time we're done, we're gonna get all the hands. Okay, so heading cut. This is very crucial to understand because a heading cut and a thinning cut will do what? That's what I'm here to teach you. You don't know. Okay, so it'll give you a different growth response. So, promote growth, yeah, but what kind of growth? I'm about to tell you. So the heading cut is defined as cutting to a stub, a bud, or a lateral limb so small that the growth is stimulated in the buds proximal to the pruning cut. And an example of so here's what it would look like, right? You see how the ends of these branches just kind of dead end? They go out and they just stop. This is an example of the response. So here was a heading cut. You might say, well, Fred, that's not a bud, that's a lateral branch. Now, in this species, that lateral branch is not sufficient to assume the terminal role of the plant. So what's going to happen is you're going to get this kind of response. So even though I left a small lateral shoot, I still induced this crown of growth. So I woke up the buds right beneath the cut to take action. So when I make a heading cut, I open up the growth around it. I cause proliferation. So now conversely, did you show them a heading cut, by the way?
Yeah, so on this little branch, I just kind of cut, again, in that internodal region that I was talking about, and that's a heading cut. And then that is likely next year going to respond with multiple pieces coming out right below your cut. So I don't know if everyone can see it, but where my pruners are pointing, that was last year's cut, and it invigorated a couple good size sprouts to come out of that location.
So you will cause proliferation near the cut. And as we dig in a little deeper, you'll have an understanding as to why that would be purposeful. So now a thinning cut, conversely, is where you cut a branch back to, let's see what the definition says, to an attachment point. So you would come back to its point of origin, or you would cut it back to a remaining portion of the tree that can sustain the terminal roll. So give an example of a thinning cut on this tree. So where she had made the cut up here to a bud, that was a heading cut. Now go ahead. So now she's made it into a lateral branch that's large enough in this species to assume the role of taking over. So if you were to make this cut, what you're going to do is you're going to drive growth into what's right at the cut. Or even if she went down to here, you're going to drive growth into this. So you will, to more succinctly put it, a heading cut will create busyness and a thinning cut will create elongation. So you're going to drive vigor into the remaining stem. Now we're going to talk in a second about why you would manipulate the plant in one of those two directions depending on your individual objectives. That's where I'm going to get you, is training systems, okay? Okay, there's one other area that trees grow from that is, this is where we're kind of going to tease a little bit into mature tree care, but this can also be a young tree that will behave this way. So by show of hands, how many of you have had, most commonly we'll get a peach or a plum, middle of summer, branch 2-inch diameter, pow, breaks, just breaks, it's hanging there, still hanging there. Got a good show of hands, you know the trick, all right, everybody, okay, good. Now, if I went into some literature, it might say, well, cut that branch all the way back to its point of attachment, make a clean cut, right, for the tree to grow. Now let's say, here's the extreme example, and it happens. Let's say I've got two halves of a tree, right? Two halves of a peach tree. They're co-dominant, it's beautiful. This half makes this hemisphere, this makes this one. Well, I come out one day and this piece is broken, right? And I've got this big arm of a stub sticking out and it's broken here. Now, if I cut it back to the point of attachment, I'm left with this, right? Well, that's imbalanced. It's gonna put a lot of strain on the root zone. It is going to get a big kick in vigor. It may break, etc. So I do need to manage that. Well, if it breaks out here, say 4 feet above the union, well, if I cut it back to the union, I get example A, which is all the asymmetry, the asymmetric loading, etc. So it breaks out here. Now, how many of you that have had branches break, you don't see it right away, you come out a month later, and there's a flood of sprouts in there. We got some nods. So there's another reactive mechanism in the plant that's called epicormic shoot growth, right? It's the reason to know it. There are little buds when you get into the thicker branches. So like this branch that Kamala has, all the anatomy is right staring you in the face. You've got every little bud is a potential growth point. There's nothing hidden under that bark. There's just nothing. There's no anatomy beneath there. Now, if I take a big branch like this one here, like that, this is upside down, mind you. But see, when you get into this size of a piece of branch, 2-inch diameter, 3-inch diameter, greater, almost always, almost all of our fruit tree species, apricot, apple, plum, peach, they have what they call latent buds in there. So they're buds that are, the plants have evolved. It's a reaction mechanism to a storm, to mechanical injury, to dieback, fire blight, whatever. That tree will then respond by sending out and waking up those buds. So if I have a broken branch, I can cleanly cut that, get rid of the jagged edge and the torn part, and I can sit back and wait and give it time. And under almost all circumstances, sometimes it won't, but most of the time it will. It'll respond with those epicormic shoots. Okay, well, wait a second. So it's above the graft union, right? I would qualify it as a sucker. Water sprouts. Water sprouts, sweet. So now what do we know about water sprouts? They have all of the genetic information of the plant. So I can, wait a second, I've got a ton of water sprouts. I want peaches on this side of the tree, or I want apples. Let's say apples because it's a better demonstration. Okay, so, well, I won't get them this year because this is all 1-year-old growth, right? But I can manipulate that growth, wait a year, and I start getting fruit on that side of the tree again. Problem solved, right? But wait a second further, if I leave all these water sprouts, it's gonna be just flooded. It's gonna be a nasty mess over here, and this side of the tree is gonna look beautiful. Okay, well, how do I achieve that? Well, I'm gonna thin out some of the water sprouts, right? I'm gonna thin them out. Well, what happens when we thin it out? Oh, we get shoot elongation. So I'm gonna thin it out, and all these water sprouts I leave are gonna race off to the heavens. And I'm still like, man, that's great. This side of the tree is super tall and busy, and this side of the tree looks more structured. Well, wait a second, I want more structure. Okay, I'm gonna thin out the water sprouts so I don't have so many. But of the ones I leave, I'm gonna head a couple of them. Then what's gonna happen? Boom, I get expansion growth, I get proliferation. And then I go, well, okay, that was good. I got proliferation, that's really busy. I don't need all this busyness. I like the structure I'm developing, but I want a little more height. Well, wait a second. Oh, I want some more height. I'm gonna thin out some of this stuff that it responded and gave me this. I don't need all that, I just need 2 or 3 of them. So I thin some of those out. I'll get to your question in a second. Now I get some shoot elongation. So I'm driving that tree into becoming what I want it to be through manipulation and knowing what pruning response is gonna happen with what type of cut. Question?
So back onto the broken branches. So if you cut it off, would it have a potential of uprooting the tree?
If I cut off the...
Yeah, and it was just one side.
Okay, so the question is, if the branch broke and you just cut it off, would it have a potential of uprooting the tree? Great question. Yes, you would have an increased risk of that, but it's really gonna depend on how much weight is left behind, what's its exposure to the elements. Maybe you have to temporarily stake it for a year or so, but that's a great question. So that's my first reaction when I see asymmetry like that. I immediately think about the loading on the plant, right? So great question. So anybody got anything so far? You kind of following my lead on the latent buds, and we can use them to our advantage. We don't need to throw away the tree because a branch breaks. Good. Question?
Which of the water sprouts do you leave when you're doing that, and which do you save? The ones on the outlook side of the
So the question is, let's say we get a reaction, broken branch. Maybe we head, so you're gonna get the same reaction out of this broken branch that you cut as that's a heading cut. In essence, you've made a heading. The tree made its own heading cut and you cleaned it up. So which ones do you leave, which ones do you take? It's totally dependent upon your objectives, right? Like, do I have enough light to give it? Do I want symmetry? Do I want it to be condensed? Maybe I head the other side of the tree and get a smaller tree. I don't know. There's no right or wrong answer. Which one to leave is so dependent upon the individual situation. But there are a few contributing factors. We don't want crowding. We don't want basically it boils down to crowding, decay, progression around the cut. It's a little bit of an advanced concept to worry about that, but it's very site specific and objective specific. Okay, here's some examples. Combination of heading and thinning. So I walked into these trees. These were a couple of peaches. These were some plums. Now, some of my objectives in pruning, I'm gonna throw out and tell me if I miss one, Kamala. So every pruning cut, every time you thrust an implement in there, cut something, have a reason. That was the first thing I was taught many years ago, have a reason. If you're thrusting something in and you're cutting stuff and someone goes, why'd you cut that? Well, I don't know, I'm supposed to cut something out of here. Well, have a reason, right? And your reason, you don't have to have a great reason, but have one. Dead wood removal. Dead wood doesn't serve any purpose, so I'm gonna cut dead branches out. Height management, so I can reach my fruit. Maybe my height is so tall that it's blocking sunlight to something or dropping leaves in my gutter. That's an okay objective. Height management, right? So dead wood, height management, structural development. Structural development can be on a young tree, which you're just planting and trying to drive into a mature status, or maybe it's the restructuring of a part of a plant that failed. But if you're trying to develop structure, so I may make this cut as I'm trying to open this up to develop structure for next year. That's a purpose. If it's weight management, say I have a long lateral portion of the tree, it tends to overbear. I'm gonna pull in some of that for weight management purposes. So weight, height, dead wood. If you wanna get into like the crossing wood stuff, that's up to you. That doesn't have a lot of meaning to me because if it's crossing and it's not going to create an outcome that's disappointing, it's really not that relevant. But again, it could be one of your reasons. But if you start to get into pruning, and I do it myself, I'll prune. And if I get to the point where I go like, I wonder if I should cut anything else out, that's my stopping point. If I don't have something that compels me, I'm probably just pruning to prune, right? So don't be afraid to pull back. Was that a question or you? Okay. Lay it on me.
That last point about you don't worry about crossing, about cutting out crossing branches.
Mm-hmm.
Could you expand on that?
Oh, yes, because I love tearing down the old dogma of cut out this and cut out that. Okay, let's say that I have a young tree. The question was, can you elaborate on cutting out crossing branches and why you didn't feel compelled to do it under all circumstances? So let's say I go out, Miley and I go out here and I get a piece of Scion wood and I graft it onto a rootstock and I let that thing get all crazy and it's all crossed up. Man, I can't have that. I'm developing the structure of this plant. If I leave them all crossed up, they're going to cause abrasion, maybe one will break, it'll be a jammed up mess. I have just started this tree off on a horrible journey. So when I go to young tree pruning, I'm almost always eliminating crossing branches, and we'll touch a bit on how to manipulate those out of the system. But if I'm in a 50-year-old apple tree and I've got a great relationship of vegetative growth to fruitful wood, and all my vegetative growth is going to be on the extremities, my structure is already developed, right? All I'm worried about is, and that part of the tree, on any of our like mature fruit trees, I'm constantly recycling growth. Every year something's happening out there because I'm pruning out this and then refreshing that and taking out old fruit spurs and thinning to let more light in, all this stuff. Those crossing little twigs will never become relevant. So for me to fuss over each and every one of them is not only time consuming, but it's not going to be relevant to the long-term well-being of the plant. And whatever small amount of abrasion might occur, it will become terribly irrelevant. And so it's not to say that you can't do it, but there's no biological need to do it at that phase. So in young age, almost always. In old age, typically not. Now, if I walk into an orchard, say I bought a house today, has a bunch of 10-year-old fruit trees and they're all jammed up, and the wood is young enough that I think, okay, I can get some of this out. Because what will happen under extreme load is they'll abrade and maybe cause one to fail. So I may do that, but I don't use it as a rule of thumb, if that makes sense. Does that elaboration give you a little more light? Okay, good. All right, so pause to review. Growth origins, the bud location, right? We learned that on the anatomy. The growth responses, thinning versus heading. So succinctly put, heading gives me busyness, thinning gives me elongation, correct? Okay, good. Suckers versus water sprouts. Does anybody, if I said, tell me a sucker, tell me a water sprout, by a show of hands, who could not do that yet? And it's not a discrimination, it's so that I can say it again. Okay, suckers develop at or below the graft union. They are genetically the information of the rootstock. We don't want that. Water sprouts generate above the graft union. So that's genetically programmed to what we want. And then we manipulate it into what we want through a series of heading or thinning cuts or branch removal cuts, however you want to term it. So very important to know. Latent buds, we learned about those. Those are the ones hidden in the thicker parts of the tree. They're there to respond if something should happen. And we'll explain a little bit further in, what time is it? We'll explain a little bit further in why it's important to know when to make these big cuts and when not to, and to initiate that kind of growth. Fruit wood versus vegetative growth. Vegetative is going to be, depending on the species, is going to be the part of the plant that's primarily foliar, and then fruitful is the part that's going to have a higher concentration of reproductive parts. Everybody good on that? Okay. Now, Kamala, you get to go through the structure system. Sorry for...
That's okay. I'm going to have you hang on to that for a minute. Just to go back real quick, you don't have to back up the slides, but one term that we didn't cover as thoroughly at the beginning of this section was apical dominance. You might have mentioned it, but I just wanted to define it a little bit better. So if we imagine that like this is our brand new little peach tree, right now this highest portion has the apical dominance. So it is essentially sort of suppressing everything below it. You're better at talking about Auxin. Feel free to jump in on that.
Oh, was that like my cue? Okay, so Kamala brings up an interesting point, and it's what drives these responses that we talked about. So in the terminal buds and all the buds, there's a hormone, it's a growth suppressive hormone called Auxin, and it gravity feeds down the plant and it bathes the parts of the plant beneath it. And as you go further down the plant, they're higher concentration. So it bathes it in a just relax, I've got it, I'm in charge, apical dominance, right? The apical part of the plant wants to be dominant, and that's through that hormone distribution. Now that's why when you make a heading cut, you disrupt that hormone distribution. So all of a sudden it's like, whoa, what's going on? Oh, it's time for me to take action, right? Because you've taken away that quieting method.
So I'll give you an example. So yes, right now this has apical dominance. Now, if I take it off all the way where it unites there, now this still has apical dominance. So I haven't really changed the growth pattern of what's going on below that apical dominance. So that's why that thinning cut, it does thin things out and doesn't necessarily result in a ton of new growth. Now, alternately, if I were to go and maybe make a internodal cut here, all I have under that cut are a few buds. And so that has essentially given the apical dominance, it's like a job opening, you know? There's no one suppressing everybody else anymore. So a lot of times you're gonna get that really vigorous regrowth right under where you made that cut, because all of these buds underneath are wanting to take over that apical dominance. So I just wanted to define that for you guys. Question?
Yeah. I put an apple tree over an apple tree, and it looked like your picture of the peach tree that wasn't pruned. And I'm trying to keep it so I don't have to go up a ladder. And every time I cut it back, it does witch's prune.
Yeah.
So how do you, where should I be cutting it so it doesn't do that?
So it sounds like you're going to want to make more thinning cuts as opposed to heading cuts. And sometimes that means finding that really tall point and coming all the way down to where you can leave behind something else that can have the apical dominance that is down lower. So sometimes it does require making a fairly significant cut if you're trying to get that limb with the apical dominance to no longer be taking over and regrowing so much. So yeah, the heading cuts are gonna just keep producing all that new growth.
And to add to that, it's nuanced. When you get into older trees, there are a lot more things to consider, and it's almost impossible when you're making big cuts, especially when you're retraining an old tree, to not get that response. Even if you were to, because if you cut back to something that can assume the terminal role, you're cutting back to something similar in size. So you're usually removing large portions of the plant. And ideally we'll have time to talk about some of the detriment that can come with large diameter wounding. But that's a great point, and sometimes you can't avoid it, is my answer. Go ahead, Kamala, dig in. I'm gonna get out of the way. And we got about 30 minutes left, by the way.
I'll take your mic now. All right, thanks for bearing with us on that. So I'm just gonna briefly talk about some different structures. You know, all these structures may suit different objectives. So a lot of times with home orchards, we're talking about keeping our trees smaller, you know, not wanting to go on ladders. That's totally valid. I love having small fruit trees in my yard. But if you're in an orchard and you need to get machinery under the trees, then you're not gonna want really low canopy limbs. So you may choose to raise it up higher and have your canopy higher for that reason. One structure that is very popular for production reasons is this open center. Was there a little laser on here?
It's up above
this. Aha. So in this example, our main trunk is pretty short, and then we've got all these scaffold limbs coming off of that, you know, kind of central area here, and they're all originating around the same place. And what this structure does is it allows lots of sunlight into the middle so that, you know, all your fruit are getting a lot of light, which is important to make them look good, make them taste good. And it's a highly productive training system. Now, this one I really like for more compact spaces. They call this a modified central leader. In this case, we still have scaffold branches, but they're kind of spaced out a little bit more, and they're all along this central stem. Now, a regular central leader that is not modified would just be allowed to grow indefinitely. The reason this is called modified is there's probably a cut up here, and you're always going to maintain this central leader at a certain height so that it doesn't get too out of control. So it is a central system, but you're not letting the tree just grow to full height indefinitely most of the time. So this one to me looks like maybe a tree that was not maintained for a while. Perhaps it lost something in this area. It seems a little bit vacant. Maybe there was a limb that fell off somewhere in here. So, you know, right now it kind of has a central area, and it could possibly be retrained to have a bit of a modified central leader. Might be a little bit late to do an open center because it would require cutting out a whole lot in the middle here. But, you know, this is a mature tree, and sometimes you just have to work with what you've got the best you can. These are kind of fun. Another orchard system, probably, you know, for efficiency, you just have this biaxial. So in this case, you've only got, you know, 2 scaffold branches, and they're all lined up so that you can kind of stack them up like that. This one, I'd say it technically is the open center, but it is cut so low, it's maybe only a foot above the ground or so, that all the scaffold is coming out very, very low. Now that's great for harvesting, not so great for equipment. I'm not quite sure what variety of tree this is, but it looks like a peach, which is probably going to be hand harvested anyway, so you don't need to get equipment in. Okay, one of my personal favorites, especially for space saving, espalier, either pronunciation is correct as far as I've heard. And that's essentially a trellis tree system that is kept flat, often up against a fence, or it's a little hard to see, but there's some little wire trellis back here. And you often are going to be tying the tree to a structure to help support it because you're getting really elongated scaffold branches that could break under their own weight without the support. However, it's great if you have a small yard. It's just a little bit of maintenance to make sure that you've got the right support in place and you don't let it get too heavy in the wrong places. Okay, so I'm not sure. Yeah,
this is the young tree. So like
right.
I cut out a lot of the stuff we have in that longer talk. So this is going to go right into pruning at planting and like the understanding the.
Okay, yeah. So we had a little section in here about planting, but we don't need that for today. So.
And I like to use the analogy of the chess response because pruning responses aren't instant gratification. It's mail off your chess move across the globe, wait for the letter to return to tell you what their move is. So it's really about knowing 3 steps ahead. If I head today, I will get proliferation tomorrow, which I will thin to get shoot elongation the next day, and so on and so on. It's an extreme example, but pruning is nothing short of a chess maneuver in the sense that you need to think 4 or 5 steps ahead.
Right. So the common guidelines for starting a brand new tree was that where this was going? That's where we're heading? Okay. Very common advice for installing your new tree and getting that structure started. Suppose you want to do open center because it's productive. It's going to give you a lot of really nice fruit. So a lot of times after planting, you're going to cut down to maybe a couple feet above ground level, and all you have is a little twig, and it'll be one of those heading cuts, and you'll get a ton of response growth, and then you can utilize that response growth to create your new structure. Now, do you want to talk about the new research, or do you want to wait a minute on that?
We'll jump it in later because it's
okay.
less relevant to the pruning.
Well, for establishing a tree.
All right. Okay, so we listened to this talk about a month ago, and this lady from UC Davis, they were given some grant money on. So in the old days, we would plant. This was the rule of thumb: plant, cut, paint, plant, cut, paint, and you would just cut to 2 feet above ground level, initiate response growth, create a structure. So this new data, she was given grant money to spend time looking at the value, we call that a heading, right? The value of heading at planting versus no pruning at planting. They found substantial amounts of root growth increase when pruning was very minimal or avoided in the first few months after planting. So we're not here to change up the system, but it gives me food for thought. So if I buy a bare root tree and it's thrashed and all I've got is thrashed, or I buy one that's just a sprig, well, I don't need to prune it yet, but I may only prune it if it's thrashed. If I can get through the first few months, this was a 3-month after planting study, they showed double the root development that they did in a headed tree. So now if I go and I infer, root development is going to give me a laundry list of benefits. Better interface with the soil, more drought tolerance. It's going to give me the more vigor the plant has, the more health it has, the more pest resistance, disease resistance. So the inference is to think, do I head at planting, do I not? Me, I'm starting to do a hybrid where if I have moderately decent structure, and this was a 3-month study, so I'm going to wait until May or June, then I might do some summer pruning to manipulate my structure. Food for thought. I'm not breaking up the old system. This is the emerging data out of, if UC Davis is coming up with it, that's, in my opinion, emerging data on fruit tree production. So food for thought. Go ahead.
Thank you, Fred. So yeah, you know, the traditional wisdom is cutting at planting, and essentially you're trying to get your structure developing as quickly as possible, and you do that from pruning and immediately invigorating new growth. But you can also wait. I kind of like the idea of starting your structure in the summer, maybe 6 months past the pruning point, and then you've let your tree have a little bit more time to develop roots. Let's see what else we have. Yeah. Newly planted fruit tree, remove the fruit. Okay, so this is an interesting topic because how many of you have heard, oh, your brand new fruit tree, it will not produce for the first 2, 3, 5 years? Anybody heard that said? A few people? Well, fruit trees are biologically going to try to produce. That is what they do. All plants want to make reproductive structures, and therefore your tree is likely capable of fruiting. So the better advice is that you should not let your young fruit trees produce, because that will take energy away from the structural development of the tree. So if you think, oh my gosh, I've got this brand new fruit tree and look, it's blooming, it's putting on fruit, it must be an anomalous tree, right? Unfortunately, that's not true. It's more that the tree is doing what it naturally does, and you should monitor it and probably take off any developing fruit the first few years so that, so the tree can really focus on the structural development, because fruiting is an energy consuming process for the tree versus vegetative growth is producing energy through photosynthesis. So taking off all your fruit is great those first few years. Now, sometimes I'm a little selfish, maybe 2, 3 years in, I plant a new tree, I may let it actually produce a handful of fruit, say 10, give or take, just so I can get a little example of it that year. But really try to be very minimal with how much production you're allowing.
Can I add a point on there?
Please.
So to Kamala's point about not letting it bear fruit as an energy consumer, maybe 5 or so minutes ago, we talked about phototropism, or we talked about apical dominance, right? And we talked about the auxin and how it bathes the parts of the plant in suppression. So if I take a nice branch that's becoming my half of the tree, and it gets an apple on it, and it does this, what that's going to do is that's going to quiet down that vigor. And so you're going to have a part of the tree that will stay suppressed, and the rest of the parts that aren't will become dominant. So if I'm trying to drive this, the fruit will deter me from that. Not only will it soak up energy, it will change the auxin transmission, and it will totally change the vigor of the plant. So it's as much what Kamala said about energy consumption, and equally, if not greater, about contortion of the structure and just annihilating what you're trying to develop. Question?
Does it matter at which point, like when you see the first signs of a flower bud, you remove it, or just whenever you have time? Because the more it develops, it takes more energy.
Right. Yeah. And as far as I know, flower production itself isn't a huge energy consumer. So you know, in my opinion, I like to keep my flowers. It's part of the appeal of a fruit tree is having the flowers. But as soon as you see the fruit setting, you know, maybe grape or blueberry sized fruit, they're fair game to take off at that point. And some of them are going to fall off naturally, but that's a good time to get them.
The flowers can remain as pollinators.
Yes, exactly. Flowers have other benefits. You know, pollinating insects love them. Another question?
Is there anything to be said for your backyard grower? You don't want a hugely vigorous tree. You don't want hundreds of pounds of fruit. If you let those fruit grow early, are you decreasing the vigor and all the new vegetative growth? Will you still have fruit production from those branches that have cut down?
That is an interesting question. Do you want to try and answer that one?
So I think the question is, it sounded like two questions in there. One is, can you have sort of like a dwarfing or slowing down effect by letting it get busy giving energy to fruit? And then was your second question whether or not you would change the fruitful behavior of the newer wood? Okay, so I guess by argument, if you were to leave a ton of fruit, you would have sort of a dwarfing effect on the plant. But if you really anymore with the science behind rootstocks, that I would just buy a rootstock that has a dwarfing effect. And usually you won't get into those complications. But let's say that you walked into an old orchard and it's got a genetic potential to be really big. I mean, by argument, you're causing a little bit of dwarfing, but also repetitive pruning. So winter, spring, summer pruning, repetitive pruning can have a dwarfing effect too. But that's a little bit of a nuanced concept. I would say, you know, yes, but you'd really be splitting a fine hair trying to have that play out, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's kind of a tough thing because we do see that with young fruit trees, especially ones that maybe did produce a lot early on, they often are kind of permanently dwarfed from it, and they don't end up getting particularly vigorous throughout their life. In fact, it's a common complaint if somebody has a fruit tree and they're like, man, it was producing really well the first few years and then it really hasn't done much. We can usually see that all that production has taken so much energy that it may have dwarfed the tree, and just sometimes starting over to get a more vigorous tree is better. But I don't know, Fred, do you have any thoughts on if it's beneficial to keep a very dwarfed tree that was dwarfed from early production?
I have a thought on it. So anybody who's had a fruit tree, like you can look at the growth increment. So I know from seeing peak conditions in like that plum, that's a peak condition on a Santa Rosa plum. You can get anywhere between 2 to 8 feet of a growth increment on a vigorous Santa Rosa plum. So if I go into someone's backyard and they say, hey, this tree's 20 years old, it's 2 inches in diameter, and the growth increments are 3 to 4 inches, I've got a pretty low vigor plant, right? So the question is really about, hey, do you like, oh, my grandchild planted it. Okay, let's leave it, it's alive, right? Hey, I want more fruit production. You gotta go, you gotta take it out. You're never gonna you can't kick it back into vigor, if that makes sense. If it's been 10, 15 years of low vigor, it's dwarfed itself, right? So economically speaking, it's removal replacement. Emotionally speaking, it's a one-by-one decision. You make your own call on that one.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Fred.
And by the way, we've got about 10 minutes left, so if we need to rapid fire or anything, you just let me know. And
okay, now we've talked about the heading cuts. Fred, I think you usually are talking more about this. What were you gonna?
Want me to jump in, or do you want me to guide you?
I think I'm gonna have you jump back in, but
I'm not a talker. I'm not a talker.
Thank you for listening, and here's Fred again.
Sorry, mind you, we do this like this Laurel and Hardy bit at the Harmony, and we have about a 2-hour-long thing, so we've got this neat choreography. This goes a little bit off script because we're condensing it. So thank you, Kamala. Can I get a round of applause, by the way, for Kamala? Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you, and back me up if I get lost on this. Okay, so we're gonna try and go really quick because we've got 10 minutes. So we're trying to create the structure. Kamala told you about some systems. Go and do a deep dive on what system you want. Maybe you want an exotic system, maybe you want to design your own. But how do I get there? It's through a series of heading and thinning cuts. Heading cut opens it up and creates busyness. Thinning cut drives shoot elongation. So what do I want? Where am I looking to head? And that'll tell you what to do. Now here's another concept to consider. So I'm gonna go through these rapid. Mind you, if you need questions, let's maybe answer them afterwards. So make a thinning cut, make a heading cut. Here I made what I consider a thinning cut. Maybe you make this cut. This is called the cut. This is the old school method, right? Plant, top, paint. Plant, top, paint, and go on down the row, and then come back in the spring or summer or whatever and start making your structure. You can or cannot do that if you choose to. Now let's say that I got my cut. The cut, which is this, right? That's the cut, which people like wince when we make the cut. So you make the cut. So here was the cut, right? Or right in here. So you got all this to wake up, right? I started to develop my primary structure. Now my primary structure on a Santa Rosa plum, and you can hold it up while I'm talking if you don't mind, is very codominant, we call it. They're very acutely attached branches. If I were to leave that over the long haul unattended, I would have branches so close in proximity that they would abut and potentially fail over time. So if I want more space between the two, I can put something in here to space these, and that will help give me some developmental space. So here's an example of spacing where I put a little, it's not terribly complex. You can come up with whatever you want. Try to minimize damage to the plant, so don't like screw it into the branch or anything, but you space them apart. Now conversely, if, so here's another example of spacing and dormancy. You can see that I'm pushing those apart a little bit. If I push them past their tolerance, they will snap. You will learn that, hopefully not the hard way, but you will feel a tension point stop there. Now conversely, what if I have a tree like this one here, that these are young apple trees, love to do it. They get all kinds of wonky and lacy and they lay over. Well, if I just leave it to its own devices, it's just gonna grow all over the place, and then I get into, where's my crossing branch guy? He took off. But I get into the crossing branch scenario and it's a mess. So now I do what is called tying. So basically you can either apply tension or apply some compression, and you can pull it back into position. So right here I tied this, I used a splint of a PVC pipe. You can use bamboo, you can use whatever you want. I made a splint, I pulled all this into position. Now check this out, it's my favorite before and after, buckle up. That's the same tree 2 years later, right? So if I did nothing, to this, I'd have had a limb over here and one going over there, and it would have this big open center and a total mess. But I was able to take and turn it into that by just tying it together. So after about a year, whether you're pushing or pulling, you will get that branch to become rigid in that position. Typically 1 full year of development will create rigidity. So it's not a lifelong thing. So now I've created this structure that now just on into infinity, I'm just gonna make my heading cuts for height reduction, thin a little bit to distribute the fruit, manage the weight on the sides, and I've got a fruiting productive plant that hopefully will have for many decades.
Fred, if you had more space for that tree, would that wider structure have been a problem?
No, that's a great point Kamala brings up. If I had more room there, I love trees, right? So I'm like, I think I can put one here. But then it starts to become limited. So like I created a bit more of a columnar effect out of this tree, so I had space for it, and I get the fruit around it. If I had more room, like that earlier picture of in the orchard, those trees get to become much broader because they have the space. Okay, making the proper cuts. Now we're gonna dig in quick. We've got just a few minutes to talk about the pruning cut. We love to disinfect, definitely between orchards, preferably between trees, and electively between cuts if you wanna go to that extreme. Some people do that over worry for things like fire blight. So maybe you're gonna, how do you get to the cut you wanna make? Maybe you're gonna do it off a ladder. These are some old standard plums, right? These are probably like 30 feet tall if you don't prune them. These are down in the valley. Otherwise, maybe you're gonna make the cut right here from the ground with a pair of hand pruners or a pair of loppers. Are you making a heading cut? You're making a thinning cut? Those are the decisions to make. Don't worry, if you are using loppers or hand pruners, you will likely not cause anything that can't be corrected in a season or two of regrowth. If you're using a handsaw or a chainsaw, please think twice about the outcome of the cut, because you can never get back in most circumstances the detriment that you might put on the plant. So quick 3-cut method. We're talking a larger branch, one you can't cut with a pair of loppers. You need a handsaw or chainsaw. So you want to make it back to the point of attachment without contacting the actual trunk tissue. It's going to look like this, the 3-cut method. You're going to make an undercut out past the point of attachment. Then you make a top cut so that the branch breaks cleanly. It doesn't tear away and get into the trunk. Then you make your final cut. So there's what you're left with. That's how you would manage a larger diameter branch. It will give you more control. Disclaimer, physics are involved in tree pruning. If it's above your head or it's a large branch, it will send you to the emergency room, especially if the handsaw is still engaged in the cut and it comes down toward you. So it's not for the type that don't like to think about that. So keep in mind the sharpness of the tool and the physics involved. If this was a big branch, I may be back here where you're sitting using a pole saw to do it, right? So, or I may go out to the end and make nibble, 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 nibble little cuts all the way back, so I'm not putting myself at risk.
Quick question. Are we sealing that cut?
Oh, I love this question. Pruning sealants. No data. I just actually listened to a cool podcast the other day. It's 4 years old, and I've never heard anything recently. So 30 years in the business, we've only painted cuts twice. It was in this assumption that we were going to limit the introduction of this certain disease that was emerging in redwoods. Never have I painted another pruning cut. I've heard of no data that suggested it's purposeful. A little bit of data shows it's detrimental, so the short of the long is no. If you're from the school of thought where you think it's crucial, it won't let you rest at night, you can paint it. It won't kill the tree, but I don't recommend it. Okay, so yeah, lay it on.
Did you mention the branch collar?
No. So do you want to tell them? Or you want
I
me to...
just wanted to give you a quick example. So, you know, sometimes people get a little overzealous and want to make a cut as close to the attachment point as possible and may even go beyond where they should. So there's a little raised area where the branch meets wherever it's attached, be it the trunk or another branch, and you want to leave that intact. That is called the branch collar. So in this case, we're making our cut right at the branch collar. So it leaves the tiniest little bit of a nub. I don't know if everyone can see that, but that is going to give you the best chance at healing over properly. And yeah, go for it.
Isn't that different depending on the variety, if it's apple or plum? Or
It's slightly different in the sense that the morphology of the plant will look different. Very seldom. Usually it has to do with the age of the wood. So what Kamala's point is very quickly put, trees have trunk tissue and branch tissue. And when you cut into the trunk tissue, you expose more tissue to potential decomposition and decay than you would if, so in essence, it's the smallest diameter, most circular cut as close to the parent stem as you can. So if you get into an elliptical cut, you've typically created too large of a wound. If you've gotten into the trunk tissue, you've created too close of a wound. And don't feel intimidated by it. Trees have a lot of responses to work around it. The biggest consideration is going to be the age of the tree. So if you're taking a chainsaw and you make a flush cut, way more damage than a pair of loppers. So again, pause to review, structure choice selection, pick the structure you like, heading cut versus thinning cut to get you there, tying and spreading to manipulate limbs to your advantage quicker, the proper cut location, which Kamala just touched on, thank you, the 3-cut method to get you to the final cut. Aspect ratio, simply put, is you're looking for the relationship of the diameter of the limb to that of the parent stem. In essence, if you had a limb that's like 1 part to 2 parts, when you get into 1-to-1 ratios, we see failures, much higher likelihood. 1-to-4, 1-to-5, 1-to-10 ratios, almost, it's not never, but it's pretty rare to have a branch failure at the union. And that's a complex topic for later. I want to touch on one last thing before I cut you out of here. So the before and after is kind of boring stuff. Before and after, before and after, before and after. Mature tree care. Here's one thing I want to touch on. Inside of trees, here's an old topping cut on a redwood. You can see the margins that were developed, that strong coloring right there. All of this growth here was the response, the new growth, the new foliage. Trees make compartments around wounds. They do not dissolve. The trees are generating only. They are not regenerative. Like an animal or a human, we would regenerate. We would cast off the old gnarly stuff and put new tissue in its place. If you fell down and skinned your knee when you were 9, you would be able to peel back the skin and see that skin mark. But on a tree, if that thing got bumped into by a weed eater at the age of 9, you can cut it apart at the age of 20 and see the weed eater damage if the wood has been preserved correctly. So trees just generate on top. So that's why it's really important to know your pruning cuts on old trees, because when you get into mature tree care, you can start a wounding process that you can't undo. So it's very, very considerate at that age. Here's some mature things you would look for, like fruiting bodies of fungi. So if I had an older tree and I saw this, I might worry about potential for tree failure. You might see some sunburning. I'm gonna manage the crown of that tree differently because I've got a weak system that it is on. These are mature tree concepts. They can exist in young trees. not as common, but still exist. You can do staking if needed for proper support of trees. And then there's not much to review here because I didn't give you much of it. But basically, takeaway is on older trees, all trees can have a branch compartment that, or a wound compartment that could be detrimental. Old trees, you're exposing more tissue. When you make a large diameter cut, you're exposing a lot of tissue to decomposition and decay. I caution you on old tree care to be very considerate of where you make the cuts, to the point of the person who asked about how do I get all these sprouts. I would much rather make a lot of small cuts and create a lot of energy producing sprouts that can help create a very sound compartment versus big cuts that will create a lot of wounds that I can't undo. You go into an old apple orchard and you can like stick your hand in those old wounds. Those branches were either severed or they broke. But if those had never been broken or pruned off, a lot of times those cavities wouldn't have developed. And I'm not blaming anyone. It could have been a tractor hit, it could have been a windstorm, it could have been too heavy with fruit. But in essence, those are the result of old wounding. Okay, that's all I got for you. I can't give you any more. Does anybody have any questions? We might want to just field a couple, and then who's the grafting demonstrator? Is he like at the door standing out there, or we have time for a couple questions? No? Okay, question.
I've got a pear tree, and the weight of the fruit bends the branches down severely. And so I'm tempted, after the fruit are picked, to cut the branch back pretty hard. And I'm just wondering what the right way to go about that is.
I mean, couple options. You can thin your fruit earlier. If you were to thin the fruit earlier and keep the fruit production closer to the center of gravity, you'd get less of that bending to begin with. If it's already too late and you've got a really bent branch, yeah, nothing wrong with pruning it back so that you get some new sprout development a little, again, closer to the center. And I don't think there's any need to take it off completely, but pruning it back.